too bad. All right. Are you okay if I start letting people in?
Sure.
Yep. All right. Lovely. 21 coming through. Ooh. Hi, everyone who's just joining us. Good evening. Welcome. I'll just give everyone a moment to come in and make sure your audio is all sorted. All right. And I think we'll press record. Right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special launch and in conversation event for Our Shadows by Gail Jones. My name is Bianca Milroy. I am your avid reader host tonight, and it is my pleasure to welcome you. Before we get started with introductions and our acknowledgement of country, as I'm getting just letting everyone in, I'll mention a few housekeeping items. Firstly, if you haven't attended an online event with Avid Reader before, please just note that all attendees are placed on mute for the conversation and the Q&A section just to minimize any disruptions. However, at the end, I'll allow everyone to unmute so you can join together in thanking our special guest speakers. If you have your settings on speaker view, the two guest speakers will take up the screen space. And if you would prefer to see everyone's beautiful faces, simply switch over to gallery view. For the tech side of things tonight, because everyone's computer or device will have different settings, we unfortunately can't offer technical support during the event. There is a chat function built into Zoom that you can use to communicate directly with your host, myself, when this evening's speakers call for audience questions. So that'll be at about 7:15 Brisbane time. This will be where you can type them in so I can read them aloud. Please feel free to send through your questions at any time during tonight's conversation. One important thing I'll pass on shortly in the chat is the link to where you can purchase your copy of Our Shadows. And also for the next 24 hours, you can use the code EVENT and receive 10% off any books you order online with Avid Reader. Now, I'd like to officially start the event with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like you to join me from wherever you may be. When we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, we pay respects to those past, present, and emerging. From where I call home, Meanjin or Brisbane, I pay respect to the Yagara and Turrbal people. I acknowledge this land was never ceded and has always been a place of creativity and community and of rich storytelling tradition. I'd now like to introduce, in conversation tonight with Gail, is Chrissy Neen. Chrissy is the award-winning author of 7 works of fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. Her latest novel is Wintering. She has written and directed documentaries for SBS and ABC and is currently developing 2 TV series with Stan. She was recently awarded the Copyright Agency 2020 Fellowship for Non-Fiction. Over to you, Chrissy.
Thanks, Bianca. Thanks for that lovely introduction. It is absolutely my pleasure tonight to be hosting this event, not in part because Gail Jones is one of our finest writers here in Australia, but also because this particular book is a real gem. This is something that I enjoyed every second reading. It is an exquisite piece of work. So I'd like to start by introducing Gail. Gail Jones is one of Australia's most celebrated writers. She's the author of 2 short story collections and 8 novels, and her work has been translated into several languages. She's received numerous literary awards, including the Prime Minister's Literary Award, the Age Book of the Year, the South Australian Premier's Award, and the ALS Gold Medal, and the Kibble Award. She has been shortlisted for many awards too, including the Miles Franklin Literary Award and the International Dublin Literary Award, and the Prix Femina Étranger Award. Originally from Western Australia, I think that's very important to say today, Gail now lives in Sydney, And I'll start actually by, so welcome, Gail.
Thank you.
I'll start by mentioning that this book has, its heart in Western Australia. It's set primarily in Western Australia, and I wonder if that was an interesting experience for you to go back to a place that you have come from.
Do you mean back in the novel?
Back in the novel.
Yes. Yes. It's a place I know well. It's a place I return to every year. I haven't been able to return this year, so WA features actually in a lot of my books. So I tend to triangulate between different countries and places and spaces, but there's often a West Australian component or reference in my work. So I've not entirely left, I guess.
No, it does seem like you have your heart there at the moment. Can we get just a little bit of a taste of the book to start with? I'd love it if you could do a bit of a reading for us.
Yeah, so this book I think has two openings. It has a sort of contemplative, mysterious opening, and then it has I guess an action opening where some railway workers uncover buried treasure in 1854, but I thought I'd read the contemplative opening. It's at just one page. So who is this girl dreaming awake of an entombed miner? What possessed her? Who possessed her to be half in love with death, swept by fancy to see a grubby face, stark in its own darkness, afraid, expectant, waiting for the kiss of life? It's a bit like reading this slide into another body. He's not really there. He's made of smoke or fog. But the sense of his presence is her wish for proximity, the way a good story peoples the world, the way you know characters in your head, but don't feel their cool flesh and the true clasp of a hand, the way they live with you, inside you, and are invisible to others. All her life she will carry this desire to incarnate. She can see as if close. He has a beard, lank hair, and maddened eyes ashine. He has a tautness to his posture. He is strained and tight. Possibly he is in pain. Possibly his body cramps or is injured by rockfall. He is 32 years old, but mud or shadow makes him appear older. Let us say he is a man perpetually shadowed. He will always be in shadow. He will always be half black and appear aged beyond his years. This miner is her secret, Modesto Varischetti. Everyone in her class has been told the same story. There it is, illustrated in their grade 7 reader. All know his name, he is a local hero. But it is with her that he lives. It is her alone that he visits. It is to her he whispers and confides the bleak strangeness of the world.
Beautiful. It really is beautiful. And the thing, I mean, apart from the idea of mining, which is, it's something that encompasses the whole of the novel. It's something that echoes through the whole of the novel. In fact, I think we should start there. The idea that mining, and not just mining for gold, which is at the heart of this book, but also the idea of other kinds of mining that are so clearly echoed in those images. What is it about mining that you wanted? What was it that drew you to the idea of exploring mining in this?
Well, I mean, there's a biographical aspect. This is not an autobiographical book. It's not a memoir. But I lived, and my family lived in the goldfields. I lived there as a child for 5 years, and as an infant as well. And I think that one of the things that happens in childhood is a kind of intensification of images, that we start to gather our image repertoire. We start to build or compose ourselves with what is around us, but is perhaps incomprehensible. So there's a kind of layering of self that happens in childhood, with which you spend the rest of your life excavating or returning to or folding back into. And I think that for me, the idea of an underground And my father went into the mines as a teenager, as an apprentice electrician. His father worked in the gold mines in Kalgoorlie. On my mother's side, there were also generations of gold miners. And there's something about that for me, it's almost a visual attachment to the idea of plunging into the earth, into the darkness, men moving about in the darkness, and the terror, the danger, the sort of strange heroism of laboring underground in tunnels under the ground with faint wavering lights on the forehead that are finding the way along corridors. There's something to me very compelling about those kinds of images, and that sense that beneath, that something lies beneath the surface, beneath the everyday, as it does, as memory lies beneath. I suppose there's an analogy.
There's a bit of a parallel with mining to writing in a way, isn't there? With the kind of the idea of plunging into the darkness, the unknown, and digging for your story and digging for ideas as well, which I found really interesting, that it kept reminding me that the book itself kept reminding me of the process of creating the book itself.
Oh, okay, that's interesting to me, because I hadn't made that connection myself, really. I suppose it is, I mean, the work of memory is the work of excavation, as is the work of grief, as is understanding history itself. But this book also has a series of explosions. And one of the things that happens in mining is that there are explosions as well as diggings. There are things being rent asunder. There's danger and precarity. And when I was a child, the mines were all the vertical, straight down, a mile into the center of the earth. You know, men climbing into cages with their helmets, with their little lights, going down a mile into the earth. But now in somewhere like Kalgoorlie, the mining is this vast open pit. So they join together all of the shafts, excavate this huge bowl of earth, you know, that is tiered, layered, if you like. And so the visual economy, if you like, of mining is very different now. These trucks the size of houses that are moving slowly in rings around this vast pit. But for me, the attraction was always the underground. And you're right, maybe, I mean, Faulkner, actually, now that you mentioned it, used a metaphor of writing as being in a car at night, and the car is moving very slowly along a road, and the lights are just picking out the story as it's being discovered. That he says that's, for him, that was what described the process of writing, not moving into an illuminated field of known things, but moving through the darkness and things coming towards him out of the darkness and making themselves visible. And so perhaps at some unconscious level, I was operating in that way. I'm not sure.
And it certainly comes across with this, the actual structure of the book feels a little bit like that in you're just kind of turning your head, and suddenly we have a new part of the story illuminated. It's something that the structure of the book is something really interesting that I'll come to later. But to go back to the idea of the super pit, because
Right.
if anyone here has not seen the super pit, I imagine that we would not have any idea. I've seen photographs of it and was astonished by how big it is. I couldn't get my head around how big this was. To actually be able to describe and to capture this idea of this gigantic crater in the ground. Did you go down there? Did you did you have to physically go into the pit?
You can, most people look at it from a viewing platform. It's very windy. There's a lot, it's a mine site. There's a lot of labor and dangerous labor, but you can sign up to do a tour, which I did, where you're given the high vis gear and the hard hat, and you get in a bus with other people with their cameras and, you know, drive down to a certain point. And even that, I mean, corny as it sounds, even the tour of the super pit was sort of exhilarating, because there was a sense of entering a mythos, entering a kind of space that could only be apprehended as a symbol, that there's something, and it's partly about scale. I'm very interested in what is it that returns us to human scale. And mining seems to have so many inhuman scales built into it, both in terms of wealth, but also in terms of the machinery, the labor, the number of lives lost, the struggle. There's a kind of inhuman sweep of history there. So I suppose that in that layering of structure, I wanted always to draw attention to the fact that we live in these vast structures, but fiction is about the human scale. Fiction is about imagining the precious interiority of other people you love or you live with or you care about. And I wanted that to be, that contrast to be there all the way through, between different levels of cognition, if you like, different ways of knowing. And that there's something actually slightly terrifying about knowing things on that huge scale where everything's about profit and wealth and machinery. And, you know, we saw the destruction of the Juukan Gorge recently. You know, that was an explosion that was heartbreaking. And that was the mining industry and its power to change utterly and irrevocably the human landscape. So I wanted to set in proximity these different scales of knowing, if that makes sense.
It does. And I suppose that layering happens with these incredibly tight, taut chapters. There's the chapters in the book are, you know, a page and a half.
They're very tiny chapters, yes.
Very tiny chapters. So much happens in each one. It's almost like we're kind of, you know, it's like the flash of a camera almost, or the flash of a headlight. And suddenly we have great detail and so much happening in this very small space. And I wondered whether that was actually an intentional structure or something that just came naturally out of the writing of this material.
I did want to write something that had very short sequences in it. I wanted it to have a jagged kind of effect. I do think that I'm less and less interested in my writing in the idea of a seamless plot. And I think that the truth of being is that we don't just move forward and accumulate knowledge, property, and wisdom as we grow. We move forward and back and forward and back. That the word that interests me is implicare, which means to fold. And I think we are always in a kind of situation in our lives where we are folding in time, where desire leads us forward, memory leads us back, and we're often being sort of shredded between the two. We are very rarely fully present to ourselves. We're always in some fluctuation between past, present, and future. And I think that had an impact, that my conviction of that and my coming to think that that's the truth of consciousness in time had quite a strong impact, I think, on the structure of this book. So I really did want short sequences, and I wanted those juxtapositions of scale. And I wanted families and people from different times to be adjacent, so that you move. Sorry, I'm going on a bit. But
oh no. I was going to say let's talk about those different time zones. Let's talk about Paddy Hannan and and having him jutting up against against Frances and Nell, but also Fred and Else. So can you talk about those different zones that you're working in?
So when I was a child, the statue in the main street in Kalgoorlie is of Paddy Hannon, the man who discovered gold in 1893. And that's all he was. He was a statue. He was a stiff, empty figure sitting in front of the town hall. But when I thought about his story, and looked him up, and it was partly a sort of byproduct of searching for my own Irish ancestry, or some of it. I discovered he was born in 1840 in a little town called Quin in County Clare. And I realized 1840, he must have witnessed the Great Famine, the Great Hunger, they call it in Ireland, 1845 to 1849. So between the ages of 5 and 9, he witnessed this mass starvation in Ireland, 1 million people died and another 1 million emigrated. So 2 million people left, and County Clare was the hardest hit of all the Irish counties. So here's a child who would have witnessed incredible suffering and seen death, and would have carried this through his life, even if it was an unspeakable experience. The other thing he would have known about was discovery of gold treasure. So just a few miles from this little nondescript village of County of Quinn, there's the remains of a 1st century hill fort, the ruins in a sort of round fort. And at this fort, there was discovered a deposit of Bronze Age gold. I mean, a treasure, a literal treasure. You can see it in the Dublin Museum. So I thought, here's someone who comes from Ireland. He comes to Ballarat in the 1860s and wanders around in goldfields for 30 years. And he wanders indigent and poor and austere and modest, and suddenly is one of the richest men in Australia, and actually in 1893 was one of the most famous men to have lived in Australia. People seem to know about him now, unless you're from WA. But that narrative, I thought I wanted to have a frame narrative of the entombed miner, the story that I read, so that story recurs. What does it mean for a little girl at school to intuitively attach to the idea of a man trapped underground? Then I wanted to include the historical fact of Paddy Hannan, and to imagine him not as a statue, to imagine what it meant to come from somewhere green and Irish like County Clare, and to have witnessed the Great Hunger, and then to have arrived in Australia and end up in the desert, and that the Eastern Goldfields is a very beautiful desert area. It's an astonishingly beautiful place. That was, of course, destroyed to create. I mean, they took every single tree to create Kalgoorlie, and Kalgoorlie was the 2nd richest city in Australia for a while. You know, so there are these shifts in history, these movements of people, the movements of wealth, and then embedded in all of that is the interiority, the feelings people have, who they love, what they care about, their own memories. And so there's the Irish diaspora, there's this Italian trapped miner called Modesto Varischetti. There's a couple in the 30s, based partly on thinking about my grandfathers, but you know, who, when Kalgoorlie was very thriving and very social and very communal, they go to the movies, the men have very dangerous work underground. And Fred, the miner that I'm interested in, he's an explosive expert. So he sets off dynamite charges in the mines. And that is intrinsically, to me, very difficult work, you know, looking along the seam of gold in a dark corridor and then placing the plug and exploding it. It's
very dangerous.
Very dangerous, very dangerous work. And then there's a contemporary story, and the contemporary stories of 2 sisters who grew up on the goldfields, now live in Sydney, and are estranged, are trying to find a way back to each other and back to their own history. So I think of this as a novel with 4 locations, really. So Melbourne is quite important because that's where Paddy ends up. Sydney is important because it's where the 2 sisters are. And then there's the Goldfields, and then there's Quinn in Ireland, in County Clare. And they're all constantly layering each other, and what's echoing between them, I guess, is images. It's not facts, it's about the patterns that we make in our lives and by which we come to know ourselves.
I think as readers, you give us a gift of allowing us to find those little glimmers of gold between each of the braids in the story.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.
I think it's wonderful. I'm very, very sick of reading books that are telling me everything that I'm supposed to feel and think and find in the book, because I find that as a reader, I find that it's incredibly boring work to just watch somebody spoon feeding me what I'm supposed to feel about a book. But with this book, it really felt like I was searching through it for those little hints of gold, and then picking them up and putting them, just as Fred does, putting them in a little kind of vial where I could kind of put them next to each other and look at them. It's a very generous act as a writer, I think, to give us, to trust us with that.
Thank you.
So thank you for that.
I mean, I think the reader is often smarter than the writer. I think that one of the things that I hate is when writers condescend to readers. Their readers have all kinds of life experience we can never know. They bring to the text oblique, unusual, sometimes wayward, even perverse readings and attachments to what they read. And that's the gift back to the writer. That's why we write. I mean, you know this too, Chrissy, that the reader is often smarter than the writer, and will see things that we didn't know was that we had placed there.
That's true. And one of the things that I saw, I'm sure that you intended this, was the Irish in Australia in those early days were seen as different, were seen as not fitting into the general culture as well. I felt like there was all these kind of putting these people from these different migrant cultures in this one place. It made me think about our relationship as a country to all these different migrant groups, to the Italian, to the Irish, to to all the different kind of people that were coming here. And of course, eventually in the book, we then come full circle to think about the migrant population of the British who came here and took this land that belongs so clearly to the Aboriginal people. So I think that was that's seeded in the book too, our changing relationship to migration in Australia.
I hope so. I mean, it seems to me important to keep on affirming that if you're not Indigenous, you've come from somewhere else. You know, that this is a country of migrants, and we keep hearing about what a successful multicultural nation we are, and in many ways we are. And there's something incredibly, there's something to be grateful for living in a country that is composed of so many different groups. I actually had a bit of a worry about the title for a while, Our Shadows, because I didn't want it to be an owl that was a collective noun that was homogenizing. That I wanted it to be, there's a philosopher called Alfonso Lingus who talks about owl as a collage, not a collective. So not a collective in which we want sameness, you know, a collective noun, but a collective that has a lot of different parts to it. And that's, I guess, how I think of my book, that it's a collective noun, it's a community I'm looking at, and a community even through history, but it's not a community that wants sameness or wants to impose one worldview. I love the fact that there are lots of different kinds of people in this nation, and that we are, you know, one little part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some interesting connections in the book too, to to generations. So you have Fred and Else, and it is Else, isn't it? It's not Elsie, it's Else.
Well, it's Else or Elsa, but Else, yes, it's Else, somewhere else, someone else, yeah.
That's why I kind of thought that it must be Else is her name. But so we've got Fred and Else, who are basically raising their grandchildren. So they're basically raising these two girls, Nell and Frances, and that kind of divide between those generations is, you know, there's this beautiful relationship that that grandparents have with grandchildren, and,
yes,
and grandparents are raising grandchildren. There's also this kind of echo that you're missing, and a shadow, I suppose, that you're between those generations, which becomes this kind of thrumming throughout the first part of the book before there's an urge to go and seek out the missing pieces. And I wondered whether that it was so true. I was raised by my grandmother, so I felt like you knew this. I wondered whether this was stuff that was being drawn from people that you knew, or whether you were I don't know how you got this so true. Basically, I was wanting to ask you about this relationship.
Oh, that's very kind. I mean, I'm interested in discontinuity as well as continuity. I mean, Australian history, especially of the 19th century, is full of orphans and of bigamists and, strange doublings and losses within families, my own family included, and my great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather, suicided in Kalgoorlie, leaving 3 children. So her father was an orphan. And that, when I first heard that story, that made a huge impression on me, because I guess because I knew that place and I imagined what a loss that might be. But I'm also very interested in grandparents and grandchildren and the special kind of love that happens between them. And the sort of tenderness that, especially I was thinking about my father with my daughter and the incredible tenderness he showed towards her, the way in which he could sort of enfold her was very moving to witness. And I think many of us have seen that. We've seen that perhaps someone who is more reserved as a father becomes more open as a grandfather. And I don't want to talk too personally. I don't want to say much more about that. But I think that grandparent grandchild relationship is a kind of nexus in this book, both for continuity and discontinuity, and for mourning and loss, as well as for recovery. So that there's a recovery towards the end of the book. I think it's a hopeful book.
It is definitely a hopeful book for sure. And there's a wonderful character, Aunt Enid, is just a delightful character, because I feel like everybody's got an Aunt Enid, who is like some kind of a, the exception to the family, the one that has kind of, she's the aunt that doesn't marry and who stays at home and who is quite, she's quite angry and quite feisty, and she kind of has her own, she's a force of nature in a way. And I love that you had an Aunt Enid in this book, and that Aunt Enid was so important in it. I just wonder whether she was there from the beginning, or whether she was something that you went to throw this wonderful difference between the grandparents and grandchildren and the aunt.
I guess it's my interest again in patterns. So I had the 2 sisters in both generations. So I had the 2 sisters from the, I guess they're from the 70s, and the 2 from, no. Anyway, 2 generations of sisters. And so the reason that the sisters in the current day are brought up by their grandparents is that their mother died after giving birth. And this is what happened to my grandfather, great-grandfather. His wife died, and that's why he died. But there's a pattern there that again is both, has something missing, has a kind of shadow to it, so that the sister who remains does grow up a bit bitter and twisted, and, as you say, feisty and sort of powerful in her anger, almost her anger at being the surviving sister. Her anger at the 2, her 2 nieces, not really being able to cope with their existence, having never married herself. And I suppose I wanted psychological complexity. And I wanted someone who actually wasn't all that nice, who was a bit passive aggressive, a bit undermining. I think that makes her an interesting character, not to be too nice.
She's very striking. I think she's a very individual person, and you don't see characters like her often in books. And I did love her. That she was quite bitter and said what she thought, and she was just throwing barbs in all the time.
She was, yes.
She is. There's a couple of works of art that play a very important role in this book. One of them is the Hokusai painting, The Great Wave, this one that's on the front of the book. And the other one is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, this book that the sisters share. And I just wondered if you can talk a little bit about those works and their impact on you and on the book.
Well, I wanted the girls living in the desert to see an image of ocean, and one that I love is The Great Wave of Kanagawa. what's fascinating about that painting, and it's so well known, it's almost a cliche, and I did hesitate before using it, but I went with my mother actually to the NGV in Victoria and saw a wonderful Hokusai exhibition, which included the 36 views of Mount Fuji. And what I was reminded of is that that's actually not a picture of a wave, it's a picture of Mount Fuji, but it's Mount Fuji seen through a wave, as it were. So again, it's about perspective. It's about the strangeness of seeing a tiny mountain curved over by a giant wave. And what I'd forgotten until I saw the actual print is the tiny faces in the painting. So, and when it's reproduced, they hardly ever include the boats and the tiny faces. They include the wave and Mount Fuji, but not the tiny, tiny faces lined up along a boat. And they're so imperiled, these sailors. They look so terrified. They have these sort of fixed cartoonish expressions of fear. So I was interested in the fact that the girls become obsessed with ocean. It's one of the things that they share as girls, this sort of fantasy life about the ocean, because they haven't yet seen the ocean. They've only seen the Kalgoorlie swimming pool.
And they also have very different relationships to that painting. So they see the painting differently, and that kind of underlines their similarity but difference at the same time.
And because that print is ubiquitous, it is, it could turn up in a newsagent in Kalgoorlie. It turns up everywhere on tea towels and, lots of merchandise as well, of course, if you go to an exhibition. But I wanted there to be a sort of random image that was an image of ocean that somehow stood in for the real thing and gave them a very aestheticized and peculiar vision, because looking at a mountain through an ocean wave. And the excuse me, the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is about walking on the seabed. That's the image that attracts the girls. Yep. Is Captain Nemo walking on the seabed with the giant octopus behind him. And I know you have an interest in such things yourself. But just the extravagance of an image like that for children, the way in which, those old books that you got from the library and you lift the tissue paper and you see the copper plate engraving, and it's something astonishing, like a man walking on the bed of the ocean in one of those huge helmets. And the way that links into the text is that Modesto Varischetti, the miner who was trapped underground by himself, the only miner in 1906, everyone else escaped except this one man trapped in a tiny little air pocket in the dark for 9 days. He was rescued by someone in a deep sea diving suit. So they sent someone, because the mine was flooded, in a diving suit with the helmet down to get him. And so that collapse of the orders of experience and that paradox of being both under the water and under the earth, that was what interested me about that.
And thus
but that was intuitive. When I say this, it sounds so well planned, and I didn't plan any of this. One garners things, as we were talking about before this began. You have a project and you garner things begin to enter that project that seem relevant to it and that stabilize you when you're reading or writing, and that's what happened.
There's also mention of the Thai rescue, the school kids that got trapped in Thailand, and that particular period gripped me and everybody I knew. And I'm sure that there's a point when people will read about reading about that rescue and kind of be there with her as she lives that. It's something that really connects, I think, to people. And I wonder whether that was all playing out as you were writing this book, because it's so...
Well, that's what started this book. So in 2018, I watched the Thai rescue night after night, for 18 nights. And there was this extraordinary attention to these, 12 little boys trapped 5 miles from the Atreyu cave entrance. They'd gone so far in. They were so... it didn't look as though they would be rescued alive until the very, very end. But there was something about the way that, there was something about the emotional drama around these children trapped inside the earth. That was when I remembered Modesto Varischetti and seeing an image of him in grade 7. That was when this novel started. I thought, I want to write about, you know, a girl obsessed with people underground. And but that's a hopeful story. I mean, against all the odds, those boys were rescued, and they were rescued by men looking after them and cradling them, and, you know, moving them very slowly, you know, sedating them, moving them very slowly, as if through a birth canal. There's something about, again, the sort of the iconic nature of that rescue, where these boys in little, you know, swaddled bundles being moved slowly through water out through the mouth of the cave. I found that so moving. I dreamt about it for months afterwards. And I think I dreamt about it because it was connecting with something from a long time ago in my own experience, as maybe an anxiety about my father, or who knows, you know.
It's a beautiful origin story for the book, actually. It just, I'm so glad that that was where it started, because it was such a, it's such a centerpiece for the book. And I feel like it's
an odd thing to be there, and certainly the editor thought it probably shouldn't be there.
Oh, I think it absolutely should be there. So I'm glad that you fought that battle and won, because it needs to be there. It was and I think all those little asides are what make this book so great. It's not just the things that contribute to this particular story, but it's the little asides that play such a big part in the lives of these characters that do contribute to the story. So yes, thanks for fighting that battle. I wanted to talk a little bit about grief, and there's an incredible passage from the book, which I'll just read a little bit of now, which is from page 29. And it's a passage which just so beautifully describes this feeling of loss and grief. She was still consoled and disturbed by the power of sexual recall. Sometimes she woke at night in a lavish sweat, flinging her arms around nothing. Her heart pounded, fat as a clamshell, even as she knew it all was dream stuff and intercourse with shadows. In the darkness, at those moments, she felt their bedroom grow exotic. The chairs and curtains, the dressing table, the tall shuttered window, and the oriental painting they had chosen together were all erased of association and became curiously strange. She might have been in another city or another country. She felt adolescent in her terror, though she weighed its occurrence as an adult. No one had told her about the nights that swell and distort after a death, nor mentioned how often and how long they might last. No one had mentioned she might rise in dark to see her own face in the mirror, pale and mysterious as the second moon, a widow at 39 and unrecognisable to herself. I reread that passage several times after I read it, because it so beautifully encapsulated that idea of that kind of, that room that's so full and yet so empty at the same time, empty of someone that you love dearly. There's so much grief in this book. It is a hopeful book, as we said so many times. I don't want to put anyone off reading it by the idea of grief, but the grief in it is described so beautifully. And I wonder how you, I mean, you can't tell us how you magically created grief on the page, but we just heard a little bit of it. But the idea of grief in this book and the idea of lost things, yeah, can you talk a little bit about that and your relationship to grief in writing this book?
Right. I had a journalist tell me 2 years ago, you always write about grief, write about something else. And I said, oh, the next book won't be about grief. But it's there. It's there in life. It's, you know, we lose the people we love. We've all experienced loss of different kinds. I didn't want it to be some sort of big theme. What I wanted was for it to be linked to the body. And I've tried carefully in this novel to have the suffering body. So Frances is feeling grief for her husband. She's the one who's the widow at 39. And perhaps it was a bit too coincidental, but he dies of, a mining disease.
As you would, I assume.
Yes, and in fact, one of the things in sort of researching mining life, one of the shocking things that I discovered was how much illness, how much danger, how many accidents there were. And just going into Trove and typing in mining accidents, it was nightmarish actually to see how many accidents there were, how many widows there were from mining. And so I wanted to think about what does it mean in a sense to be a mining widow, even in this day, even in, the book is sort of set 2018, 2019, but what does it mean to experience the body going blue from lack of oxygen? And that's what happened to so many miners. And if you go to mining museums, you see all of these medical details about the deaths of miners. So I wanted to have the suffering body and the laboring body in this book. And I guess that's the basis of the grief. I didn't want it to be too abstracted. And there's also, I guess, a Second World War grief because, people of my grandfather's generation lived through the Second World War, and I wanted that to be part of it as well.
And we haven't even got on to talking about the dancer, Marty Friedlander, and I'm aware of the time, so I'm not going to go into it now, but it really is a beautiful, poignant part of the book, this dancer and how this dancer, Marty, weaves through the lives of the people in this book. It's just astonishing. This is quite a masterwork, Gail.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for writing it.
I guess that's the other kind of body. So there's the suffering body, but I hope the novel also says there's the sexual body, there's the dancing body, and there's the body that's aroused by the wind and by movement and by, being in the world, just the sheer joy of being in the world and watching the birds in the morning. I tried to make this book balanced. I didn't want it to be too grief-stricken and forsaken. I wanted a sense of, here's the complication we all deal with. Here are the layers that we're existing in every moment of our lives. So that's what I was hoping for.
For every light, there is a shadow. I think I took that from the book as well, that there's the light in the book and there's also the shadows as well. So very, very beautifully told. We do have just a short bit of time for questions. Bianca, how are we going for audience questions?
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions come through, Chrissy. Thank you so much, Gail. I'm being just hooked by the conversation. It's fascinating. And Sarah Ross would like to say, so she said, "Our Shadows sounds great. Can't wait to read it." She would like to know, was a lot of research required and how much travel was involved, Gail?
Okay, so the fun part of the travel was that I did go to Ireland, but not until, but I didn't go to Quint, this little town, until after I'd written the book, and I asked the publisher to wait a few months until I went there. But that was wonderful to go to the place, and I went to the Hill Fort, and I did that sort of, being there kind of research. I did need to read up a lot about mining. I didn't really know very much. In fact, I went on the internet so often looking up mining things that I started being offered jobs in the mining industry. So there's an algorithm somewhere that says this person's obsessed with mining, and I even had job offers from Canada. Would I like to join, become a miner in Canada? So that's the, who knows how my data was being sold from. But I think. I think a novel starts from very inchoate, mysterious and vague things. It starts from an image of a man trapped underground, and then you sort of build around it. And I didn't want it to feel too laboured by, I know a lot about Irish in Australia, and I was very careful not to put it in the novel, to have it, as it were, feed into the character of the Paddy Hannan, the discoverer of gold in Kalgoorlie, but not to sort of weigh him too much.
It certainly that certainly comes across, and just those little glimpses of mining life were so clear and so perfect, actually.
Fantastic. So we've got Laura Alvery as well as asked. I'll just get that question back up. It's about the dream. Here we go. So Gail, you mentioned writing of a dream you had about the Thai cave boys as fodder or sort of origin for the book. Have you had have any of your other dreams ever fed your work?
Often, actually. I mean, again, it sounds a little naff to say so, but dream logic interests me. I mean, I do seem to dream a lot, and they're often hyperbolic, lurid, strange dreams. And figuring out dream logic, the fact that there are bizarre juxtapositions or strange leaps in time and space, or the fact that you feel you're running but you have no legs, they're very strange distortions and torsions, that movement, the torsions of sense and sensibility and of the body that happen in dreams. I mean, these really fascinate me. And it was more that it was the Thai boys as a kind of birthing that interested me. And when I thought about the dream, the boys were like in swaddling clothes, like mourning garments as well, the way they used to wrap up mourning garments. And actually this is a completely irrelevant aside, but asbestos, which also features in this novel, asbestos was used in the cremation in the early Greek Empire. So asbestos was regarded as a very mystical mineral because it was incombustible. So when they didn't embalm, when they burnt the bodies, they would wrap the bodies in a sheet of asbestos so that the ashes from the body would not mix with the ashes from the wood. And so this whole idea of a wrapped body, a body that is a birthed body, but also a dying body, I think that's something of that might have been in the dream. And I don't want to sound too mystical about it. It's really just about thinking about images, how images work.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Any more questions?
There haven't been any other questions so far, but everyone, if you did want to send through a question, I'm sure we would make time for it. But yeah, Chrissy, it sounds like you have a few other questions up your sleeve.
I do, and I actually want to ask Gail, because I have a project going at the moment where I'm talking to writers, particularly writers who are writing contemporary fiction, and I'm very interested to see how this pandemic that we're living through will impact on contemporary fiction, and whether writers feel like it's something significant enough that we're going to have to layer this pandemic that we're living through into our work in some way, whether it's a ghost of the pandemic or whether it's the pandemic itself. What do you feel about this one, Gail?
Oh, that's a really tough question, Chrissy.
We're very early in it, but I'm really interested to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it does feel as though there's a whole our emotional lives seem sort of warped by this experience, especially the lack of touching, not being able to touch people, not even to be able to give someone a hug when you see them or a kiss. So there's something about physical estrangement that I think will have deep-seated and persisting effects, and I'm not really sure what they will be. And I wonder whether people will actually become more reserved and more self-enclosed after this, and perhaps less physically exuberant. I'm not sure. So much of what we hear about the body at the moment is about disciplining the body. It's actually about exercise. Here are the exercises you do when you're locked in your home and when you're sitting at your desk, and here's what you do when you go for your walk. And there's something strangely tyrannical about that, this idea that there's a disciplining of the body that needs to happen during COVID. The exuberant body, the body that dances with a partner or that, greets an old friend with a hug, that's no longer possible. So there's this whole sense that the way we move in the world has changed. But the other thing that's changed, and again, this is about images, is the mask. So in parts of Sydney, lots of people are wearing masks, and there are certain points of hypervigilance where you go to the supermarket, and 70% of the people will have masks. And that sense of seeing people come towards you but being unable to read their faces. At first, I didn't think of it, and now I realize how fundamentally we are the face in our social interactions. I think it was, who was it? Jean-Paul Sartre, who talks about this, the way in which our face represents us, which is of course, our anguish and our whatever triumph for some of us, not for me. But this idea that the face is masked, and that what to me the extraordinary image of this age is the masked face. So, and the masks that come over people when they are dying, the covering up of the face. I find that, so distressing every time it comes on television. The same story about someone dying in intensive care, it's always the mask going over the face. And that notion of a smothering of the beloved face, the face of your, grandmother or something, I think that's really hard to think about, and it will somehow persist.
I can't wait to see what you make of this time, Gail, because I think if anyone can make something beautiful out of what we've been experiencing for the past year, it will be you. So I do hope to see something that echoes.
I'm not planning to write a COVID novel, I must say. So
it may be a covert COVID novel.
Okay. Well.
COVID might be snuck into the novel in terms of these themes and ideas. But so look, I think we're almost at time now. This particular book has really been one of the pleasures of the past, of the lockdown. So since March, this has been one of my pleasures, has been dipping into this book.
Thank you.
Discovering this language anew, because the language in this book is so beautiful, and the ideas are so resonant that they do echo. So I really, really urge anybody who is here today, or anybody who isn't, and you want to tell them about it, to actually take this book, to read it, and to press it into the hands of somebody who needs it, because it really is an astonishing piece of work. Gail Jones, it has been a delight to speak to you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Avid Reader and all the Avid Readers out there who've joined us tonight.
Thank you so much. If that was Chrissy and Gail, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you both very much. And just very quickly, I'd like to just sort of give everyone some ideas as far as, just providing some more wonder and inspiration, and for all things writing. I've posted a link to where you can keep up to date with Avid Readers events and workshops. Please do follow us and follow Australian authors on their social media accounts, and support independent bookshops like Avid by purchasing our books. We hope to see you at another Avid Reader event soon. It will be online at this stage, but go, Chrissy.
And Bianca, as a special treat to finish off tonight, I've clicked so that you're allowed to unmute yourself. And I think that if you can reach forward and unmute your computer, we could end today on a clap for Gail and her wonderful book. So,
do it. Yay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.